Good morning, everyone. This is John Lehman, Director of Member Value with IFMA, the International Food Service Manufacturers Association. This call is being recorded, and we will post the recording on our website, ifmaworld.com. Welcome to Vested, 5 Rules that Transform Business Relationships. IFMA brings together the most curious, most innovative, and most actionable minds of food service to ask the ifs and find the answers, so that today's industry can grow into the possibilities of tomorrow. Our mission is to enable our member community to focus on critical issues affecting their business and the industry. I am pleased to introduce Kate Vitasek. At President's Conference 2013, Kate, author of the book series Vested, took the audience deep into collaborative relationships to help them understand which types are appropriate for which relationship. Today, she steps to the next level. Vested, 5 Rules that Transform Business Relationships. Author, educator, and business consultant, Kate Vitasek is an internationally recognized innovator in the practice of supply chain management and outsourcing. Vitasek's approaches and insights have been widely published in over 200 articles and 5 books, including Vested, How P&G, McDonald's, and Microsoft are redefining winning in business relationships. World Trade Magazine named Vitasek to their list of the 50 most influential people and ideas impacting global trade. Vitasek is a faculty member at the University of Tennessee Center for Executive Education and is the founder of Supply Chain Visions, a top 10 boutique consulting firm specializing in supply chain management. We will be taking questions over the chat function on your screen. Now I will turn the call over to Kate Vitasek. Kate?
Excellent. Thank you, John, and to everyone who's dialed in today for this webinar. My goal of today was to really build on the topic that I started the discussion on at the President's Conference. And what I wanted to show today is the 5 rules that we found in our research that really made all the difference in the world for companies like P&G, McDonald's, and Microsoft who were working with their suppliers. So my advice to you and my lessons to you for today from our research is how can you take some of these rules and apply them in your own supplier relationships or your own customer relationships if you are a supplier that's on the call today. So let's start with a little bit about our research and what our research has done. Our research was actually funded by the United States Air Force. And you might ask, well, why would the Air Force fund research into supplier management and supplier development and supplier innovation? Well, it's because innovation is huge for the Air Force, as I'm sure it is for your companies as well. Innovation is what brings top-line and bottom-line cost savings benefits because it challenges the products that we bring to market. It challenges how we manage our processes to drive cost efficiencies. And so the Air Force, like many companies or organizations, wanted to challenge suppliers to say, how can we work to drive more innovation? So we went out on our research to study some of the world's best at innovation and how they were really working with their customers and suppliers to bring forward innovation into their relationships. And in that journey, we ran across companies like P&G, McDonald's, and Microsoft. They actually became a topic of one of our books, Vested, How P&G, McDonald's, and Microsoft are Redefining Winning in Business Relationships. But our research has led to 5 books in total, and they really are very different in nature. The one I'm going to focus on today is that second book, the white book, called Vested Outsourcing, 5 Rules that Will Transform Outsourcing. And so I'm going to cover each of the 5 rules. And I'm going to do so in a high level. I'm going to try to bring forward examples of how companies in our research use this rule and why the rule is so important. Now, as we get started, I want to remind you that there is a chat feature on this webinar, and I'll be monitoring that. And so please feel free to ask questions along the way. Sometimes I'll pause and answer a question directly, and sometimes I'll wait until the end of the webinar to answer those. But please do forward your questions along the way, and I will make sure I get to as many questions as possible. All right, a little bit about these rules. What are these rules that can help you in your organizations work either better with your customers or your suppliers? Well, at the heart of the rules is having a mindset that we call what's in it for we. It's really a win-win approach to your business relationship. Now think about this. Most of the time when we deal with a supplier or a customer, we're sitting across the table negotiating. The customer might have had an RFP. They are trying to use the market or the competition to drive the best price, the best value. But we aren't asking the question, what about innovation? How do I create value? Instead, they're trying to buy something, a good or a service, right? They're doing what I call value exchange. How can I get the best price and the highest quality or whatever for this widget, for this product, for this service, whatever it is that they're trying to buy? And the simple fact of sitting across the table and negotiating really puts a damper on the ability for companies to innovate. And what we found in our research is that the companies who were able to innovate the most with their partners had more deeper discussions. And these 5 rules were the areas that their business relationship was based around. So I'm going to go through each one of those rules today. So rule number 1, real briefly, I'll talk about each one, and then I'm going to flip the slides and go through each one in more detail. So rule number 1 is outcome-based versus transaction business model. Rule number 2 is focus on the what, not the how. Rule number 3 is clearly defined and measurable desired outcomes. If I'm going to focus on outcomes, I better know how to measure those and define those. Rule number 4 is a pricing model with incentives that optimize the business. And finally, rule number 5 is insight versus oversight governance structure. So let's dig into each one of these rules. I'll start rule 1 with a wonderful Dilbert comic strip. And this is going to demonstrate what I call the activity trap in action. It says, this class will make me more efficient. I don't want to be more efficient. You're working on a government contract and billing by the hour. No, now go bill them for the time you stood here and stared at me like a stuffed deer. You know, we kind of laugh at Dilbert. He makes us sit down and think sometimes. But this gets to the heart of the flaw in a transaction-based business model. In a transaction-based business model, I'm buying a unit of a product or a service for $1, right? I'm going to buy something, you're going to give me something in return. And every time we have a transaction, the service provider makes more money. Typically, their profit is directly linked to those transactions. They like more volume. They like doing more work. That's why we call it the activity trap. How many times have you sat there and thought about your supplier and thought, how can I drive more efficiency? But if I'm a supplier and I'm driving efficiency, it's like shooting myself in the foot if my profit is pegged to the transactions, right? We've created a catch-22 in how we do work. And so what we found in our research is that the companies who were the most successful got out of the transaction-based philosophy. They didn't peg the service provider's profit to those transactions. Instead, they pegged it to outcomes. Let's look at an example here from Procter & Gamble. Now I'm going to use a few examples. I've picked Procter & Gamble because it's a service that everyone can relate to. The area that they have really applied vested thinking is in facilities and real estate. I bet every single company here, whether you're a customer or a supplier, has facilities that you have to manage. You've got manufacturing buildings, you've got office buildings. Well, P&G said, we wanted a supplier that could take charge of the buildings, not just take care of them. How many times have you gone into the airport and seen that they have a little chart on the wall and someone's come in and cleaned the bathroom every hour, but yet that bathroom may still be dirty, right? So just the simple fact of buying an activity or a transaction doesn't mean that we get the outcomes that we want. And so this is where P&G began to challenge the conventional wisdom of transaction-based thinking. They said, I want a partner who's not just going to show up and clean the toilets and wash the windows, but who's actually going to take charge of the buildings. So think about it. If you have a budget for facilities and real estate management, what would happen if you partnered with your supplier to proactively drive the budget down? They get more money by figuring out how to spend your budget dollars better. Right? That's the difference between a transaction-based philosophy and an outcome-based philosophy. You're taking the buyer and the supplier and you're putting them on the same side of the table, and you're putting the business problem in the middle of that table saying, how can we solve our problems? You can do that with a budget issue. You could do that with new products, right? How can you bring me new products? When you bring me new products, I'm going to reward you more. I'm not just going to buy your product. You're going to get rewarded more heavily. So we want to change the nature of how we look at our partners to drive outcomes and not just to drive activities. Again, I want to remind y'all to submit questions through the chat button if you have any questions along the way. So what were P&G's outcomes? If you think about a statement of work for facilities and real estate management, especially a company that's P&G's size, you could be looking at literally hundreds of pages. I've looked at facilities and real estate management contracts for some of these large companies like Procter & Gamble, and believe it or not, they can literally run hundreds of pages. The worst I've seen is 800 pages with 550 measures. So P&G was pretty simple. They said, you know what, we don't need, we still need people to show up and do the activities, but what is it we're buying? What are these outcomes? And so they had 5 simple outcomes. Provide services of equal or better quality at lower cost. So their business partner for facilities and real estate management was Jones Lang LaSalle. And they said, Jones Lang LaSalle, here's my budget. How can you do the same work for better, and cheaper? Can you solve that problem? P&G calls that the power of the and. They wanted a world-class supplier that would provide support and dedicated account management. Their particular scope was 60 different countries and hundreds of buildings. And so they wanted a set minimum level of service across all of these 60 countries, so that if employees were in Germany or in Brazil, they would get the same level of minimum service that they were getting in Cincinnati. So they wanted that world-class support. How would they roll out new business? For example, when they acquired Wella and they acquired Gillette, they wanted someone who had the span and bandwidth to manage their account on a global basis. And for that reason, their third desired outcome was to build a global relationship to support P&G's business objectives. So when they did have things like acquisitions, or they were expanding their business or contracting their business in certain ways, they wanted someone with a global relationship that could respond to their business needs, not just simply show up and do the work. Now, the fourth desired outcome was to have a supplier that would guarantee the availability of resources. P&G doesn't know what the next thing is they're going to be working on. And so that's why it was very important to them that they could have flexibility. So yes, they bought activities, but they also bought the flexibility of the supplier to be able to flex with them and change. P&G calls this flowing to the work, right? We don't want to just have people showing up to do the work in a set, static way. We want to flow to the work and the business needs, because business is dynamic and it changes, and we need to address the dynamic nature of our business needs. Now, lastly, they wanted P&G to satisfy the facilities management needs of world-class global corporation. So yes, they did have key performance indicators and metrics, and they were buying a certain service level from Jones Lang LaSalle. But as you step back and you look at these outcomes, you see that it wasn't just about the statement of work and a price for the work. It was really about something bigger and broader that allowed them to align Jones Lang LaSalle's work to business needs, to outcomes rather than simple activities. And unfortunately, one of the things that we see many times when we look at contracts and business relationships, it's all about the activities. You're getting stuck in the activity trap. It's like looking at the forest, right? We can't see the forest because we can't get past the trees. So we need to step back and think about what are our outcomes and how do we drive those outcomes. So that's rule number 1. Let's dig into rule number 2. Rule number 2 is focusing on the what, not the how. Now, I have here a picture of a square watermelon. And for those of you who might not be familiar with a square watermelon, they were actually invented in Japan. And it's because the retailers in Japan had a little business problem. They wanted to sell watermelons at their grocery stores, but they didn't have the logistics and distribution processes enabling them to do just-in-time delivery. In Japan, the stores are very, very small, and so they like to have just-in-time. They want 1 watermelon. They want 2 watermelons. Think about how we ship a crate of watermelons. It's a great big crate, right? You have to have a pallet jack just to get it off the truck and in the back room of the store. Well, in Japan, they did not have those pallet jacks. They didn't have the floor space to put a whole crate of round watermelons. And if you have a round watermelon, you can't ship one at a time on a truck. So they stepped back with the farmers and said, we'd love to sell your watermelons, but we just can't distribute them efficiently. So a couple of farmers got together and said, well, how can I solve the distribution problem for watermelons where I could ship them one at a time? And lo and behold, they actually figured out that if they put a box around the watermelon, it would grow in perfect form to the size of the box. Therefore, they could get square watermelons that could be placed in a box and shipped one at a time. And so the moral of this story is that if I tell you how to do something, I'm always going to get what I've always done. So rather, we should be thinking about those outcomes and those business problems and then challenging our supplier, how can you help me solve my business problem? So what does that do to our statement of work? Right? Think about this. Go back. I encourage you to go back to your statement of works. Did you tell the supplier exactly how to do the work that you wanted? Or are you challenging them to do the work in a smarter way, to drive innovation? And I think this is very profound because the companies that have gotten the most innovation from their suppliers are the ones who don't handcuff their suppliers with a detailed statement of work and specifications. Now, yes, you still need quality levels, right? You're going to have to do that, but you want to constantly encourage the supplier to challenge how the work's done. Now, I've pulled an example from a contract that speaks to environmental cleanup of environmental hazards. This is actually from the Rocky Flats Closure Project, which was a Department of Energy contract with CH2M Hill. Now, you might imagine that if I am doing environmental hazardous cleanup, it is going to be very specific. We have to be very safe in how we handle that, right? Well, yes, we do. We have government standards that say I have to have certain quality levels, but look how they address the flexibility in their work scope. We want to seek ways to accelerate cleanup actions and eliminate unnecessary tasks and reviews by requiring that the parties work together, right? We want to challenge the way work's done. Here's another excerpt from their statement of work. Provide the flexibility to modify the work scope and schedules, recognizing that priorities may change due to emerging information on site conditions, risks, and resources. It's impossible to know the future, so we need to create an environment that's very flexible, and when these business conditions happen or new information happens, let's seize it and take advantage of that. Let's go back to Procter & Gamble's example, and I didn't put a slide in here for this, but how long do you think the statement of work is for dining services? right? How long do you think that is? It's 6 bullets. Worldwide, 60 countries, hundreds of locations. That includes not only the cafeterias, but the kiosks, the catering. It's 6 bullets. Why should Procter & Gamble tell Jones Lang LaSalle and their dining partner Compass how to do dining services? They instead said, you tell me, you're the experts. You write the statement of work that's going to challenge the conventional wisdom of how we've approached dining services and drive innovation. And that's exactly what they got. Very interesting on Jones Lang LaSalle and Procter & Gamble, actually. They 3-time Supplier of the Year in the last 10 years. And you wouldn't think about it, but they actually won P&G's most innovative supplier. Dining, facilities and real estate, managing your boilers and generators and your mailroom. How could you be innovative with something so simple like that? But yet they are out of 80,000 suppliers. And it's because they don't handcuff Jones Lang LaSalle. Instead, they liberate them. You tell me, you challenge how I'm going to do something. I'll go back to Rocky Flats. And one thing I find interesting here on the Rocky Flats case study, we talk about environmental cleanup. They had glove boxes. And it was taking about a year to decontaminate a glove box. And CH2M Hill was able to, over time through innovations, reduce that to 3 days. 3 days. They had over 200 innovations that they brought. All right, well, let's look at rule number 3, clearly defined and measurable desired outcomes. If I'm going to move to a world of outcomes, how do I measure outcomes? And I love this quote from Yogi Berra. He says, you've got to be very careful where you're going because you might not get there. And I think that is very pertinent because when we look at how companies are working with their suppliers, they tend to be a little paranoid and want to measure everything that moves. We call this measurement minutia. So when you're measuring everything that moves, you tend to not look and measure the big picture. So we like to think of this, we use an analogy called the Watermelon Scorecard. Because it's green on the outside, you're measuring all these activities and you're doing a good job on the activities, but it's red on the inside because you're not bringing innovation, you're not reducing costs at the rate we want, you're not solving our business problems. So green on the outside, red on the inside, we call that the Watermelon Scorecard. So what we see happening in these highly successful business partnerships is they tend to reduce the number of measures and focus on outcome level measures. I'll go back to the Procter & Gamble example. They have 10 measures. Worldwide, facilities and real estate management, 60 countries, 10 measures. They have 3 critical success factors and 7 key performance indicators. You don't need to measure how often somebody went in and cleaned the toilets every hour. Instead, you can go back and look at an audit and say, how clean were the toilets? I'm going to audit every 30 days, right? So one audit can actually help drive the elimination of a lot of activity-oriented measures. When you look at how companies do this, they take their desired outcomes, right? So they list those outcomes that they want, and you really try to align a high-level metric to the outcome, not having a simple detailed measure to the activity. All right, I'm going to move on to rule number 4, a pricing model with incentives. Let me give an example of the difference between a price and a pricing model. A price is something you go to Starbucks and pay, say, $3.29 for your grande 2-pump vanilla latte. A pricing model is what Microsoft did with Accenture for their back office procure-to-pay services. So building up an actual model to say how does the business work? What are the costs associated with the business? What are the triggers? What are the cost drivers? What are the assumptions? So how do we build a cost model that's going to model the nature of the business versus set a specific price on something? Because when I set a price on something, isn't business dynamic, right? So from the day after I've established a price, our price has the opportunity to get out of equilibrium. So there's going to be a winner or a loser. The buyer is either going to get a windfall or the supplier is going to get a windfall because the price is static. So we need to move to pricing models. Now, the second part of rule number 4 is not just a pricing model, but that it has incentives. So I want to share with you a quote from Taylor Hawes, who was the general manager and controller for Microsoft's financial operations. And he's the one who really had the vision to work with Accenture differently in how Microsoft managed their back office procure to pay. So think about it, accounting, accounts payable, accounts receivable. Microsoft chose to work with Accenture as their strategic business partner. Now, they had worked with other business partners around the world. They had 100 different subsidiaries. Some of them were outsourced. Some of them were actually insourced, so they had their own employees doing that work. Some cases, for example, in Italy, you might have had your brother doing the work for you, right? And so they said, we're going to work very strategically with Accenture. And I love this quote. It says, we could lift and shift where the service provider would quickly as possible determine a clear and accurate baseline, which they would be expected to improve with Microsoft. The service provider would then be highly compensated for achieving transformational results. So in this case, Accenture came in and did with Microsoft a baseline for the work, and they agreed on that baseline and they built a pricing model for that. And Accenture, if they could beat the baseline, would make more money. So yes, Accenture has to make money on doing the work, but they are highly compensated for beating the baseline, for doing things better, faster, cheaper, more productive, more efficient. Go back to rule number 1 where we heard that Dilbert cartoon, right? If I'm getting rewarded for showing up and doing the work exactly the way you've always told me how to do it, I'm probably not driving innovation. So we want to put our money where our mouth is. We want to provide the service provider with an opportunity to earn very good incentives when they drive transformational results and bring you innovation. So rule number 5 is insight versus oversight, governance structure. I'll choose here another cartoon to get my point across, right? It says the next level of real-time vendor relations, but we're still beta testing. Before I was an academic, I used to work at Microsoft, and we used to call this one throat to choke. When we would work with our suppliers, I'd say, I want a single point of contact. I want one throat to choke. And so that's how we manage. We manage our suppliers with fear because Microsoft was a big company. We could get away with it. Well, golly gee, if you're not meeting my needs, I'm just going to bid this out and switch the supplier. Why do I care if you can't meet my needs? I'm Microsoft. So what we're starting to see is companies, including Microsoft, start to challenge this mindset. It's not about managing the supplier. It's about managing the business with the supplier, right? So we're moving from a me mentality to a we mentality. Let's look at the traditional approach, that me philosophy. I need the service provider to meet my needs. Here's my statement of work. I need you to drive my price down. Finding ways to meet our mutual needs. Golly gee, here's a baseline. Could we transform? How could we drive innovation? And if we drive innovation, how do I share the value of some of that with the pricing model, right? Instead of saying it's in the contract, now it's your problem, saying together we can work to achieve performance and compensation goals, right? Because when you look at a root cause, one of the things that you start to see when you really go do root cause analysis, often the supplier's problem is an input problem from the buyer. It's our problem, not the supplier's problem. And Microsoft actually found that when they were going in doing real root cause analysis is that Microsoft was causing many of the problems. And if you just push the problem to the service provider, they put a box around it and they push back, right? And so we now need to broaden that. It's our problem. How do we solve this? And when we do that, we need to move away from the blame and punishment environment to really communicating the issues, jointly finding solutions, real root cause analysis. It's not the supplier's Six Sigma program. It should be our approach to managing Six Sigma, and how do we use the data to help us solve and get to the real heart of some of our business problems. And lastly, unpleasant surprises. We don't want to have that mentality. We actually want to have integrated planning and communications. How do we get up front and manage the business, not just managing the supplier? So those are the 5 rules. I'm going to pause here for a second and let you enter in some questions into the chat button. So I do have a couple of questions that have come in along the way. So one of them is, how do companies that have a statement of work, how do you actually move away from a statement of work? What would that look like, right? What would a statement of work look like? I mentioned Procter & Gamble's having 6 bullets for dining services. That's a hard leap for many companies. And so we actually recommend what we call a taxonomy. A taxonomy is an inventory. If you look at the word taxonomy and think about it in terms of science, right, you're taking an inventory of work. And so what we do is we take this simple inventory of work and you create what we call workload allocation. So is the customer doing that, or is the supplier doing that work? And we want to divide up that work. So we want to look at a statement of work holistically. It's not just something that the supplier is doing. We're looking at the work that needs to get done across the business, and we're dividing that up, and we're taking that inventory and we're allocating the work. So our rule of thumb there is that you go to the level of detail that it is one of the parties can be fully accountable. So if you have a box, if you have an item and it has both the buyer and the supplier doing something, that's a big trigger to us that you have a duplication of effort, and that's driving cost and also potentially allowing you to be micromanagers if you're duplicating that. So we want to take that inventory of work and divide up the work in a very smart way. We want to allocate that. Okay, here's another question that's come in, and it's regard to governance. Someone said, can you explain what a vested governance structure looks like? Well, there's actually several components to a governance structure that is more vested in nature. One is to have tiers. So we want to not just have that one throat to choke like that cartoon. We actually want to consciously build tiers. So having folks that manage the day-to-day operation, having a higher level and an executive level. Oftentimes we forget to have an executive level connection with the supplier and the buyer. And at that middle level, the management level, we tend to manage too low. So we tend to be focused on our green scorecard at our quarterly business reviews, but we should be focusing on the business needs in the future and what innovations. One of the things that I'll look at when we look at governance structures is to actually look at the agenda of your quarterly business reviews. It should not be a regurgitation of all the activities and work and the metrics that have happened over the last quarter. It should be future focused, right? Another component of governance that we want to look at is that we have peer-to-peer. P&G calls it 2 in a box. So we want to actually align the buying company with the service provider for key roles. So one of the key roles that we often see that is missing in a relationship is what we call the transformation management role. If indeed you want outcomes and you want to drive transformation, it's very hard to expect the person who's doing the day-to-day service delivery or manufacturing of the thing, right? So whatever it is you're doing, those activities that you're doing, if your person that is your key account person is focused on the day-to-day transactions, they're never going to drive the transformation. And so we often see a splitting of those roles. So you have a service delivery, and I say service delivery, but it also could be product delivery, right? So you have someone who's managing the transactions as well as someone who's managing the transformation. Okay, here is, and this I think is a question for IFMA. What is the website to read this webinar at the end? And I'm going to leave that for John at the very end. So John, if you'll pick that one up, that'll be great. All right, so my last, now that we've covered the rules, I want to go in and change the vantage point of what I'm going to be sharing in this webinar for the back part of it. And now I want to talk about, is vested the right business model? So we've covered the 5 rules. I've given you some real examples of companies who do this. But one thing I want to share is vested is not right for every single type of supplier that you've got. Procter & Gamble has 80,000 suppliers. They should not have vested relationships with 80,000 suppliers. And you really need to think about your portfolio of suppliers and saying, which ones should I be more strategic with? Where should I drive innovation in my supply base? Likewise, if you're a supplier, which customers do you want to choose to invest in? Because customers that have a pattern of bad behavior and just beating you up and not, being price, probably aren't the customers that you want to choose to proactively invest and drive innovation with. So we've written a white paper, which I've made available. John actually IFMA will be posting this on their website, and we'll be sending it out to all the attendees. But it's actually called Unpacking Sourcing Business Models, 21st Century Solutions for Sourcing Services. And we wrote this white paper with the Sourcing Interest Group, the Center for Outsourced Research and Education, and the International Association for Contract and Commercial Management. And in it, we profile 6 sourcing business models. Vested is just one of those 6 sourcing business models. So I'll use this graphic to kind of share the different models and how they might relate to your particular business. Now I have 2 axes on this particular graphic. On the lower horizontal is shared value, and on the vertical axis is level of dependencies. Most organizations think in terms of a make versus buy. And if I'm in a make scenario, I'm going to do something in-house, they're at the very, very top of the graphic up here. So let's see, I'm going to put this little pen highlighter on. Let's see if I can get this to work. So they would be up here. And they either are going to do something in-house and have all of the rewards go to themselves, or maybe do a joint venture, right? So you may have a joint venture with a supplier, but I'm going to be an equitable partner. I'm going to have ownership in that make decision. So if that decision pans out well, it's going to be mine, and I'm going to reap all the awards. Now, if I choose to buy, we tend to see organizations use one of 3 sourcing business models, and they're very transaction-based. So we have a simple transaction provider. That would be one where you would maybe have a purchase order. So I'm going to issue your purchase order. You're going to give me goods and services. If you're a little bit more strategic, you may be an approved supplier. So I have certain quality levels, certain things. So you may be on a short list. So my buyers now aren't just going to go to the market and try to find something. They have to work with a small number of suppliers. And if you're really strategic, you might fall into that preferred supplier bucket. Hey, you're really special. I'm only going to buy stuff from you. Well, what happens here is those make a lot of sense, and we should be using those 3 categories. But unfortunately, for those more strategic suppliers, we're still using a transaction-based business model. Remember rule number 1? So I've said you're strategic, yet I'm going to micromanage you, tell you how to do the work, and buy activities. So the more you move up this curve, you need to break out of the transaction-based and into a performance-based or an outcome-based approach. And there are 2 forms of sourcing business models that kind of move up the continuum for a strategic supplier. One is a performance-based relationship, and one is a vested relationship. And they're different. It's not that one is better than the other, it's just that they're different. And so when would you want to move up this continuum? Right, I'm going to change and get a different color here. Let's go for green. If there aren't many suppliers in the portfolio, or you choose to proactively be strategic, you're choosing to be strategic, you're moving up the continuum of dependency. And when you move up the continuum of dependency, you want to move up the ability to share value. Oops, there we go. So when I share value, if I choose to be strategic, I should be choosing to move to outcomes and to have a pricing model with incentives. Think of it this way, right? A win-win relationship is about growing the pie, not fighting over the pie. If I'm down in that transaction-based relationship, I'm sitting across the table, I'm negotiating, I'm fighting over the pie, right? So if you're a good negotiator, you're going to get a better piece of the pie. Well, when you become and choose to become very strategic with your suppliers, it should be about growing the pie. Because when we grow the pie through innovation, we're able to then share that pie, and it becomes a true win-win relationship. So vested is a hybrid business model. It's not simply a buy business model, and it's not a make business model. It acts like a make. It acts like it's an in-source, an investment-based model, because you are, as a buyer, investing in the supplier through a long-term committed relationship. They are investing in you by physical dollars and resources that are going to drive innovation for you. And so having that commitment and managing your contract and speccing out your contract based on outcomes and paying the supplier for those outcomes is a game changer. It truly has the power to drive innovation. And so we shift from that conventional buy-sell business model that focuses on transactions to an outcome-based business model focusing on results. Now, should every single one of your suppliers be vested? No. P&G may not be able to create value, that continuum down here, right? Can I create value with every single supplier? Maybe. Do I have the time and energy? Maybe not. So we tend to want to look for areas where we think there's a big opportunity to drive outcomes or transformation. And I find it very interesting that if I'm a P&G, one could argue, isn't facilities and real estate management really just a commodity? So shouldn't they be down here at the transaction level? Well, if you're the size of and scale of P&G, you have a tremendous budget. So there is a great deal of transformation that could happen with cost savings, with other areas, right? With being able to manage things on a global basis more effectively and efficiently. So it's really a choice based on how much opportunity you think you have. So the more opportunity to drive innovation, the more opportunity to drive transformation, the more you should move up the continuum to a vested type model. Now I want to toss out an example here that I think is interesting. I used this example in the President's Conference, so that's why I chose not to do it here. But I talked a lot about McDonald's because McDonald's is one of our case studies. Beef. Is beef a commodity? I think almost every organization would look at that, an individual, and say, yes, beef is a commodity. Well, McDonald's chooses to make beef not a commodity. It's a strategic weapon. They've chosen to have a few number of suppliers. There's 5 suppliers worldwide that manage McDonald's beef. So they've chosen to have a high level of dependency, and for that they get a high level of shared value, right? And it's in how they structure their relationships. So just going to a sole source relationship, right, if I say, well, I'm going to have one supplier, right? I'm going to have one supplier, and I'm going to choose to be very strategic. If you don't structure your relationship around the 5 rules, you may not get the value that you want because you're still buying activities. You're not pushing the envelope to create value and drive outcomes. So that's a pretty complex slide and concept that I just shared with you. I want to see if there's any questions that are arising in the chat button. All right, here comes one. How do you know, how can you look at your suppliers and determine which ones should be more vested in nature? Well, the white paper that I mentioned previously, the Unpacking Sourcing Business Models, in the back has a matrix, and it's actually called the Sourcing Business Model Mapping. And it's just a very simple little matrix. You can use that straight out of the Unpacking Sourcing Business Models white paper. We also, part of our courseware at the University of Tennessee, we actually go through and do workshops around this. So you can bring, instead of role playing, we call it real playing. And you can bring examples, and we actually help you go through the sourcing business model and ask yourself the right questions to say, should this business category be more vested in nature? Okay, here is another question that's come up, and it says, my procurement team uses a 2x2 matrix to say which suppliers are strategic. How is this different? Well, that's a great question, because if you look at what we're sharing here on this slide, it kind of is a 2x2 matrix, right? Because up in that, if I was to divide this slide, right, into a 2x2, right, this could be what you'd say would be strategic up here. Now, I'm not sure of the educational background, what all training your procurement group has had, but the traditional approach to think about the 2x2 for segmenting suppliers is called the Kraljic model. It's named after Peter Kraljic. And they use axes that are different than our axis. It's basically how much money do you spend and how much risk. So instead of dependency and value, you're saying, wow, I spend a ton of money with this customer, with this supplier, therefore they must be strategic. And what we have shown is that sometimes things you might not spend a lot of money in an area, but it could be strategic for other reasons. And the reason that we actually look at that is because is there an opportunity, right? Is there a business opportunity? And the bigger the business opportunity, no matter how much you spend, those are the areas that you want to create value. Do you have what P&G calls a wicked problem? Wicked problems are great opportunities to partner more strategically with your suppliers. So that's a great question. All right, any other questions that have come in on the chat? Wonderful. All right, well, that looks like that's all the questions that we have. If you have some more questions, please feel free. My email address is here, kvitasek@utk.edu. We have a dedicated website to the concept of vested. It's called Vested Way. And in that, we have several resources. One is a free 6-module orientation program to vested. So it's a kind of online, go at your pace, and that is a wonderful resource. You can just sign up for that. It is free. You can share it. The white paper that I shared is actually from our library. So you can visit our vested library at the University of Tennessee, and you can download any of our white papers as well as case studies. I do have each of our case studies. We have a short version of our case studies that is downloadable for those who want to look at it. And I'm assuming, since this is the IFMA group, that y'all would be very interested in the McDonald's case study, and so there's a short case study on that as well. And the longer version of the case study is actually featured in our book, Vested: How P&G, McDonald's, and Microsoft are redefining winning in business relationships. And if you haven't read that, if you aren't familiar with McDonald's, and I'm sure most of you are, but it really is fascinating. The governance and how they manage these strategic suppliers is very fascinating. And you know what? I'm going to step back because someone actually asked me this at the President's Conference, and I thought it was a fantastic question. I'm a McDonald's supplier, and how come, they don't treat me like a Vested? I don't sense that they're following the 5 rules with me. Well, go back to Procter & Gamble. They have 80,000 suppliers, right? So to become vested with a supplier is really a choice. So which areas are going to create the most value for the buying company, and then they choose to increase the level of dependency. And when you do that, you want to follow the 5 rules. And so not everything should be vested. Many cases we actually should be down here in a more conventional buy-sell relationship. But it's a wonderful thing if you think that you can create value. If you're a supplier, I encourage you to go back and as a supplier, give your customer the books and say, golly gee, have you seen this research out of the University of Tennessee? I think we can drive more innovation. I'd like to see if we can move up that continuum to a more strategic vested relationship. Lastly, to go back to our resources, we do offer executive education courses, folks like yourself. We'd love to have at the university. We have a 3-day executive education class coming up April 7th through 9th, and we would love to have some of y'all in our class to learn more about vested and how it could apply either to you as a supplier or to you as a buyer who's working with customers. And we often get, quite fascinating, we often get buyers and suppliers coming together as a team. So they think they should be more strategic, but they're exploring should they be working that way. And so we'd love to get buyer-supplier teams to our class. So that's it for me on the webinar. John, I'm going to turn it back over to you to wrap up because I think we've answered all of the questions today.
Great. Thank you very much, Kate. There is one other question that needs to be answered. What is the website to read this webinar? It will be posted within the next few days on the IFMA website, which is ifmaworld.com, one word, ifmaworld.com, and you'll be able to navigate to it very easily. It'll be both the slideshow and the recording of this conference. So I want to thank you again, Kate. We appreciate you joining us to share your valuable insights. And you'll find many other resources for food service professionals on our website as well, too, including Kate. And you can go into the search box if for some reason you can't find the presentation and just type in Kate's name. And you'll find some other things that Kate has done for us as well on our website. So with that, I will say thank you all for your time today. And Kate, again, thank you, and have a very good day.